of research design, sort of we discuss how we should carry out our sort of uh, uh, let's say, how can we make the causal arguments, right? So we talked about uh, what kinds of comparisons we can do, right? That was what we did in the last class.
Yeah.
So today we will end that section by arguing how, when you have a research design, what to avoid. And from there, we will proceed to another aspect of qualitative research, which is called process tracing. So you will probably remember from the last class that we had talked about the fact that in any research design, when you have to think about it critically, I had argued that you should not state your research in a way so that it sounds like the rain is falling because water falls from the skies. There must be a clear, discrete difference between what you can call rain and what you can call water falling from the sky. And what happens is that often, in order to make your propositions look absolutely tight, you try to make them sound as if something is producing something else, but those two somethings are actually not very different. So the discreteness of your independent and dependent variables is very, very important. Can you tell me what is a dependent variable? Yes.
Dependent variable is the criterion you're interested in.
Yeah. Give an example.
You want to understand how democracy comes.
Mm-hmm.
So
Then what is the dependent variable?
often you can hypothesize to be reasons for the fact that the dependent variable comes to being. Say economic development, say class structure, say.
Excellent. So what is the independent variable then?
So, where the independent variable is the predictor which can move freely on scale, the dependent variable is the research interest or the fact you're interested in to be explained or to be predicted by the independent variable.
Yeah. So essentially, if you say that the bourgeoisie produces democracy, then the bourgeoisie is the independent variable, because democracy doesn't depend on the bourgeoisie. Well, democracy does depend on the bourgeoisie, but the bourgeoisie doesn't depend on democracy, right? This is a simple way to understand the difference between independent and dependent. So then again, we are following these principles. The bourgeoisie is not democracy. It's not like saying that rain happens when water falls from the skies. Bourgeoisie is a certain class, and what people like Barrington Moore and others say is that when there is the prominence of a certain class in a society, you are likely to get democracy. So the bourgeoisie and the democracy are concrete and separate identities. And democracy, as you said, is the dependent variable because that's the one you want to study, why it happens. And you are making the argument that it depends on the independent variable, which has a causal impact on the creation of democracy. Independent variable could also be political culture. I'm not saying, you can say that when certain liberal ideas dominate, that could be an alternative way of thinking about democracy, right? But you have to then argue that those liberal ideas within a certain space is not democracy. If you argue in such a way that liberal ideas produce democracy and the difference between liberal ideas and democracy is not great, then it's a little bit like saying that rain occurs when water falls from the skies. Okay. So when you're looking at any research design, this is one thing that you have to be very cautious about. The second important thing is that you must also be very clear about what your theory should lead you to expect. Social science theories, whether they are driven by qualitative methodology or by quantitative methodology, there should be clear expectations. So that when you don't realize those expectations in the real world, you start finding problems with that theory. Doesn't necessarily get completely falsified, but your faith in that idea becomes less. So if you say that the bourgeoisie produces democracy and then you get Donald Trump, then the faith in that idea becomes less, because the United States is the richest country in the world. It has one would think that the bourgeoisie should dominate that particular country, and you are actually getting autocratic behavior, right? So, but you're able to find the problem because you're actually able to see the relationship between independent and dependent variables. And this is a quality of thinking that you need to develop when you're doing social science, that produces a puzzle. So people can be puzzled by your research design, you can be puzzled by somebody else's research design, and then try to correct that research design or build a theory. Then you may be looking at a lot of things, but actually omitting what is the real thing. That's the omitted variable bias. So let's say you argue that democracy happens when you have a strong bourgeoisie, but you have ignored the idea that if the strong bourgeoisie gets, let's say a bureaucratic class, if it is a bourgeoisie class which is, let's say, not independent of, let's say, the landed classes, or in alliance with the landed classes, then you don't get democracy. So Barrington Moore has these stories about when the landed classes and the bourgeoisie come together, which is Germany and perhaps Japan, then even the presence of a large bourgeoisie or a very powerful bourgeoisie does not produce democracy, right? So then in your research design, you have neglected the power of the landed classes and their relationship with the bourgeoisie. Or let's say, Sherry Berman argues that civil society is not necessarily a great thing for democracy, because the civil society can actually get captured by ethno-nationalist forces, as they did in Germany in the 1920s, when the NSDAP became very powerful with the German clubs, the Vereins in Germany. So they penetrated Germany not through political parties, but the parties became narrow and conflicted. But the dark horse actually entered civil society, which you might think is the realm of the bourgeoisie. A lot of people think that civil society is the realm of the bourgeoisie. And civil society was penetrated by the National Social Democratic Party with a severe ethno-nationalist outlook. So what can happen is that you may have omitted a variable, or you may have also looked at causality in such a way that the variable actually does not work in that way. So one way of looking at the bourgeoisie would be to say that it's a parallel power, the class which produces a parallel center of power which takes on the landed classes. But then the question is, what is the relationship with the landed classes? Then the question is that does that parallel structure of power actually produce democracy or not? Or does it actually produce autocratic government? So, if you believe that, so one example from international relations theory would be that you have a theory which says that democratization, that democracies don't fight wars with each other, but there are many other variables that cause wars. So, for example, in the next class, we will look at a variable called security dilemma. Security dilemma is a situation where if you increase your security, your adversary also feels insecure. And because the adversary feels insecure, the adversary is likely to rev up security. This is a concept that was given by John Hertz and then developed by Robert Jervis. Now, Robert Jervis actually says that security dilemma can become more or less depending on the strategic situation on the ground. So, one of the strategic situations on the ground which raises the security dilemma problem is a situation when offensive strategies and defensive strategies are indistinguishable. So, let's say I'm just producing nuclear weapons, and everybody knows that nuclear weapons are not used. Then the adversary might not think that they want to attack, because, I mean, nuclear weapons are defensive weapons, right? So there haven't been major wars between India and Pakistan after the two countries got nuclear weapons. I mean, Kargil did not become a bigger war, Pahalgam did not become a bigger war because there's mutually assured destruction. I'm just taking South Asian examples. I mean, you had a war between India and Pakistan in the 40s, in the 60s, and in the 70s. And then there have not been major wars despite very heavy conflictual conditions, right? I mean, India-Pakistan relations must be at an all-time low, but there are no wars. So what did Pakistan do? It created nuclear weapons, and India worries about China. So India also created nuclear weapons, not because of its threat perception from Pakistan, but because of its threat perception from China. Again, the whole idea is that if you have nuclear weapons with second strike, which means that you the weapons that you use are such that once those weapons have hit you, you cannot hit all the weapons that exist, and then therefore be a quick counter reaction. So there are a lot of sea-launched ballistic missiles which are in the different oceans, and you can do this in a number of ways. You can keep flying your nuclear assets so that they are never stay, or you can keep moving them in trains. But nuclear weapons with second strike is when you have some nuclear weapons in submarines from where they can be launched. And it's almost impossible to destroy the entire nuclear capability of a country which has second strike. Now, if you have nuclear weapons with second strike, then one would argue that deterrence becomes very possible, very probable, because nobody would, even Hitler would not like mutually assured destruction, right? So, but on the other hand, let's say you're living in a world without nuclear weapons, and artillery production is becoming far more sophisticated and advanced. Then people might have reason to think that let's attack quickly and get the advantage from a war. So there may be strategic environments where defense may be the best strategy, and there may be strategic environments where offense may be the best strategy. Jack Snyder argues, he has this famous idea called the ideology of the offensive, where he argues that the First World War happened because every country thought that the best thing to do would be to enter into the war before the other. And none of them realized that it will become such a protracted conflict. Now, coming back to methods, if you're somebody who's looking at the impact of democracy on wars following Immanuel Kant, or if you're looking at, let's say, the impact of balance of power on wars, arguing that, whenever somebody becomes more powerful, power will be balanced, you might also need to take into account a variable called security dilemma, where you can have more or less security dilemma depending on whether you can distinguish an offense advantageous security environment from a defense advantageous security environment. You get the point? So, I want to understand wars, right? I just have to see whether I have taken all the variables into consideration before I can understand what is the propensity for war, or why did a war happen. So the whole thing is that, let's say you are studying wars and you've looked at many variables and you've not looked at security dilemma. You've looked at balance of power, you've controlled for balance of power considerations, and you're trying to argue that democracies don't fight wars with each other. And then I'm looking at your research design and I'm saying, have you taken a look at security dilemma? Maybe the wars that were caused had nothing to do with democracy and had something to do with security dilemma. Even though there may be a correlation between democracy and no wars. You understand what I'm saying? That's an omitted variable. My famous example is that I am most highly correlated maybe with the chair in front of me, which is not the cause for my being in this class. There are many other reasons for me to be in this class, right? So if you have to understand what those reasons are, you actually have to understand what the class does and look at all the variables that produce the presence of the teacher in the class and all the variables that can create the absence of the teacher. And then the very important thing is that the dependent and the independent variable should give us the range of outcomes. This is very, very important, because a problem in many research designs is that, the classic case is that of, in comparative politics and political economy, there is a very powerful idea of the developmental state. Chalmers Johnson wrote this book about the MITI, the MITI miracle in Japan. Then there is work by large number of scholars on how Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea grew rapidly. And all of these books and all of these articles actually produced a literature called the developmental state literature. That there was this worry that, or there was this, let's say, there was this proposition that came out of dependency theory, which argued that backward, underdeveloped countries will never be able to progress in the global capitalist system, right? That comes from Lenin, that is in Wallerstein, that basically colonialism or neocolonialism is a way of the capital-rich countries to exploit the capital-scarce countries. That is, we read more about this. I think you already have Lenin, right? But we read more about this. Well, maybe we can do a little bit of that in international relations class as well, dependency theory. Now, for this whole baggage of dependency theory, which comes is inheritance from Marx and Lenin and Wallerstein, there's a very powerful argument that there are no pathways from the global economic periphery. And then you quickly saw that countries in East Asia started growing very rapidly and transformed themselves. So these dependency theorists then began to argue that what went behind South Korea's growth or Taiwan's growth or Japan's growth, and all of this literature started coming much before the rise of China, was what they called a strong state, borrowing from a Weberian idea of state and how states can perform. And they argued that these states did not follow the market logic. In fact, they intervened with markets in order to engineer world-class companies. So Japan picked its winners. The MITI, the MITI, the Ministry of Industrial Trade and whatever, they picked their winners. There was a similar organization in Korea that picked its winners. And it was not market logics that made, a Toyota or a Hyundai or a Samsung what created, or a Foxconn. What created these winners was basically very, very state-driven capacity to provide strategic finance and to handhold companies in a very strategic way so that they can graduate, not just to become national champions, but to become international champions. So this became the saga of a very state-driven growth. Of course, so there was this question of a hard state and a soft state. Nobody said that these countries were actually autocratic until they became quite rich. I mean, South Korea was autocratic. Japan could not afford to be autocratic because it had lost the Second World War and there was a lot of American influence on Japan. There was no way Japan could become autocratic. But countries like Taiwan and South Korea had been autocratic and they promoted growth. So there is a very powerful body of ideas behind dependency theory. But if you read King, Cohen and Verba, you'll find that it's not a good research design. Even this powerful paradigm of thinking of a strong state producing, because King, Cohen and Verba and some others argue that you will be led to believe that a strong autocratic state produces economic growth, rapid economic growth, right? Which is also something that has happened in China. But that precludes the fact that you have only looked at those countries which are constant on the dependent variable. I mean, your dependent variable was rapid economic growth. And you studied only those countries which have undergone rapid economic growth. You didn't study countries which did not undergo rapid economic growth, which means that you did not vary your dependent variable. I mean, it might be very good. You may have been excited by the fact that, East Asian countries were growing and you wrote one book on Japan, then you did an edited volume on 3-4 other countries, but there was no variation on the dependent variables. And there are a lot of countries which have undergone modern economic growth, which are very rich and which are not autocratic. So even what looks like very good research can be scientifically very flawed because, there are no proper comparisons here. I mean, Taiwan and South Korea are very different. I mean, they're all East Asian countries, but Taiwan is much smaller. I mean, Singapore is smaller than Berlin, probably. There are many differences apart from the fact that they are in Southeast and East Asia. And all of them have undergone rapid economic growth. And you have neglected all the countries that didn't undergo rapid economic growth, which are also autocratic, which may also have hard states. And you have not looked at many countries which are very rich and which are liberal democracies. And which have, so the question of isolating the hard state to argue in favor of rapid economic growth becomes less believable if you put it in a research design. Because it's just like, I wanted to study why somebody is having high fever. And I only studied conditions of high fever, but I didn't study conditions of low fever. Then how would I understand, what would be the difference between a low fever and a high fever? So that is another big problem that such research design faces. Now, do you have any questions? Yeah.
You said that a certain theory can have some exceptions, right?
Yeah.
And they may not act as we may think they should, and there can be certain exceptions, right? But then it really makes question that do we really need to reduce a certain phenomena to a specific length when we are also admitting that it can have exceptions, rather than just, intuitively looking into things, why we have to, allude to a theory then, when we are
The reason why you have to allude to a theory is that if you do not allude to a theory, or if you don't think theoretically, then you are just looking at descriptive materials. But if you start thinking theoretically, then you might actually be moving from description to some kind of explanation. That does not mean that your explanation is right, or that it cannot be improved, or it cannot get into the waste paper basket. You understand what I'm saying? You may think that the bourgeoisie does not produce democracy, but if you consider the bourgeoisie produces democracy, then you might find in many countries that pattern working or that pattern not working. If it works, then you feel more confidence. If it works under some conditions, then you can advance the theory in that direction. The bourgeoisie does produce democracy, but not when the bourgeoisie is in alignment with the landed classes. Right? Similarly, if you go deeper into Reuschmeier, Stevens, and the criticisms of Barrington Moore, you'll find a lot of which I described in an earlier class, right? And you can also then get puzzled by the fact that America is turning autocratic, India became democratic when it didn't have bourgeoisie. So there are 2-3 advantages. It's a little bit like saying that Newton was puzzled when the apple fell, because he was not just interested in the phenomena of the apple fall. He was interested in why the apple falls. And he might have read Aristotle and, all the classics and all the philosophers and found that, now, you might think that Newton was an idiot. He might just have been an idiot, like many geniuses are. I mean, people are going for a dance, they're going to do many other things, and this guy is just, daydreaming and trying to find out why the apple fell. I mean, that sounds a rather boring type of person. But he was asking a fundamental question. And not that all the theories about the apple fall were perfect, but this identity that comes under Newtonian mechanics, distance is equal to half gravitation constant into time square, is a product of Newtonian mechanics. So, when I drop my pen, you can predict the time from the distance and the distance from the time, given the gravitation constant. The gravitation constant on Earth will be different from the gravitation constant on the Moon, will be different from the gravitation constant on Jupiter, right? Now, you go into the subatomic world, and then you will say that, atoms and protons are not behaving in that way. So then you can go into quantum mechanics. Not because quantum mechanics is right, not because Newtonian gravitation is right, but then you try to find out what are the conditions under which they work and what are the conditions under which they don't work. So that is why you do theory. Not because the bourgeoisie produces democracy, but because it is an explanation which you can contest. Does that answer your question, or were you asking a different question?
It does, but no.
I mean, you can have faith in the fact that there is no need for explanation. That could be one ontology. But here we are saying that there is a kind of an assumption that everything that happens has a certain reason why it happens. Now, you may disagree with that philosophical position. Then there is no problem.
So why the explanation has to come from a theory when a person looking into a circumstance can tell like these things, these factors are involved for a phenomenon to happen, right? And to be honest, if I maybe see that from a specific lens, let's call it a theory, then that may tend to leave out things which I can observe, right? So
no, that's very good. That's how science progresses. I mean, Kenneth Waltz wrote this book, which was predominantly balance of power, and he said that bipolarity is durable. Bipolarity collapsed. There's no problem. Now, we don't have to start disrespecting Ken Waltz because he gave you a structure of understanding international relations. Now you can think more deeply about balance of power. You can think, I mean, he was looking at bipolarity. He wrote the book in 1979. That was the height of the Cold War. He's a human being. I mean, nobody here believes that there cannot be progress in science. And, he may have given you a conception of what he calls the international structures, which is a good way to think about the international realm, which can be contested. So when I was doing my PhD at Columbia University, the theories of international relations class in a certain year was taught by Helen Milner and Robert Jervis. In those days, Robert Jervis was more like a structural thinker. Robert Jervis is a very complicated guy. I mean, he's written on decision making, on psychology. And then when he was teaching us, he was more like a structural guy that, the international structure makes. And Helen Miller was more of a domestic politics scholar. And they used to debate with each other. So 45 minutes, Jervis will talk about why. Jervis was also a student of Watts. Why, the international structure matters, why structural considerations are important. And then 45 minutes, Helen Miller will come, and that's a great lecture. That doesn't mean that you buy the structural argument or you buy the domestic politics argument. And Waltz already in his book, which was his doctoral thesis in 1959, had talked about man, the state, and war. Man was all the arguments that come from human nature. State was all the arguments that come from domestic politics. And war was international structure. So he had given 3 levels of analysis to understand wars. Now, the point I'm making is that when you do all of this, you are not necessarily saying that I have written that ultimate book, which you should believe in until you die. And scholars also evolve, they change. I mean, when you do your PhD, you are somebody, you grow up, you evolve, you do very different kinds of things. Does that make sense? Or I'm completely saying something that you didn't want to hear?
Yes, so in this context, does epistemology precede ontology? Is it the other way around?
Well, I guess the ontology is important. Yeah, ontology is important. Did I get your question right or did I not?
No, I mean, you did get it right.
I did get it right because I'm a little confused right now. And it's a good question to ask because it's a very fundamental thing. And I find that a lot of people, Bob Jervis used to say that, the word explanation and the word description are 2 simple words in the English language. But making that leap is a huge leap. It's like Neil Armstrong saying, what 1 step in moon and big step for humanity. For mankind, yeah. So it sounds like very simple, but it is not, because description is a way of thinking and explanation is a way of thinking. And when you are thinking of using description to understand explanations, it is a very big leap. So I think I don't think my time is wasted because even after a lot of discussion, it does not sometimes go through. So, causal laws, well, in the social sciences, you really don't have causal laws. They are mostly propositions, but these propositions can be like about security dilemma, like balance of power, like bipolarity is more stable than multipolarity in a balance of power world, is one proposition. That means what? Bipolarity is likely to cause less high-level conflict. That comes out of Waltz's thinking. Democracies are not likely to fight wars with each other is another proposition. The bourgeoisie produces democracy is another proposition, right? So in physics, maybe you have causal laws. In the social sciences, you have conjecture, and you have representation. Individualism causes suicides. is a proposition. Mental illness causes suicides is a proposition. Party competition causes communal riots in India is a proposition. Social capital makes an impact on communal riots in India is a proposition. Social capital produces development is a proposition, right? But then when you look at these propositions, as I mentioned to you, there must be covariation. You should not be just looking at only developmental states. You should compare developmental states with those that could not develop. Just like, Durkheim was comparing populations which had high levels of individualism with low levels of individualism to get high levels of suicide and low levels of suicide. So covariation is very important. I'm not saying that Durkheim is right, but if he was to argue that mental illness doesn't cause suicides and individualism does, then he would have to control for mental illness in the populations and co-vary both individualism and suicides, which is what we began our story with. Make sense? We are moving away from description to explanation. We are saying that we are not just looking at a lot of suicides, but I think yesterday the news was that a 16-year-old committed suicide in St. Columba's School in Delhi. Now, there's a lot of discussion. If you go to the YouTube, you will find that the court has passed some orders. This boy was being harassed by the teachers. He had given hints to the parents. The parents were almost going to take him out of St. Columba's School is one of Delhi's best schools. And then he committed suicide. Now the thing is that all of you who don't know much about suicides will also be thinking about why the suicide happens. But if you know a lot about the theory of suicides, then you will have a much better way to understand the same empirical situation. Was the boy depressed? Was the boy individualistic? Or was the boy repressed? Right? So you will be thinking in terms of, now the thing is, just this one boy is not going to give you a theory of suicides. Maybe there are differences within age groups. When a young boy going to a school commits suicide, who's a teenager who's kind of has a lot of life changes, both biological and social psychology inside the system, the causes of suicides might be different. So it's not like mental illness will give you the answer or individualism will give you the answer, but it's a way to think. Those who don't think in that way will be thinking more like this happened, this teacher did this, that teacher did this. But even the judge of the High Court or the Supreme Court, if he or she is aware of the different types of reasons behind suicides, then you will actually be able to collate that data much better in order to get even to an understanding of that single case. That's the difference. And I personally have a bias. You may have a bias. You might actually think that the world has no regularities and therefore we should not be getting into it. But that's a very respectable intellectual position. But if you have that intellectual position, then probably the political science that we are doing is not for you. You understand? That's not necessarily a wrong position to have. But that's a lot of the things that we do here is trying to actually find, after deeply looking at history and our cases, something undergirding. And I will be stressing this as we get into causal mechanism. The other thing is that, correlation is not causation. So just because this chair and I are perfectly correlated doesn't mean that this is the reason why I am here. So when you're looking at a world war, when you're running regressions, you can often make this mistake. You can say that I have 99 level degree of confidence percentage, whatever. At this level of confidence, I can say that this must have happened because they are correlated. But a lot of people will tell you that correlation is not causation. Unless there is a causal reason why something is happening. And oftentimes, one of the best ways to understand why something is happening is to do case study work. And in case study work, oftentimes process tracing is very useful because, and I will elaborate that, because in a case study, you are actually, whichever way you do it, you will trace some processes, right? And I'll get to that. Now there is often this question of too many variables and too few cases. So too many variables and too few cases is that from the perspective of causality, when you're doing case study work, because you're likely to be historically inclined or even inclined in terms of collecting a lot of data from a few cases, causally, regression analysts and many sort of causal arguments would argue that you should have many more cases than your variables. And you've got into this thing of case study, and you think that three variables are actually causing your outcome, or two variables you're causing your outcome, and you have only two cases. That is not causally very significant, because if you can actually show a lot of cases to argue for your proposition, then the level of generalizability or the causal significance of your argument increases. So, bourgeoisie produces democracy is a proposition that has not exactly been proved right or wrong, but it has been tested on many cases because there was a powerful proposition on the ground. Similarly, Lenin's imperialism is a very powerful way of thinking because monopoly capital is producing imperialism. And imperialism is the dependent variable. Monopoly capital is the independent variable. You have one independent variable producing one dependent variable. Lenin varies the independent variable. United Kingdom, France, and Germany. 1, 2, and 3. High, medium, low levels of monopoly capital. And result dependent variable is highest level of coverage of imperialism, medium level of coverage of imperialism, and relatively lower level of coverage of imperialism. So you have co-varied, you've got your outcomes, and Lenin did not say that when finance capital is very high and industrial capital is very high, then you get imperialism. What he did was he fused the two variables into one, called it monopoly capital. So this is something that researchers who are especially doing few cases have to understand, that can you be looking at the few variables or the one or the two variables that can provide the necessary and sufficient condition for your results. And you can actually find out necessary and sufficient conditions much better because you've gone deep into those cases. You can't find it through statistics. So without which something could not happen is necessary. But which was actually required for something to happen is sufficient. And if you can get those necessary and sufficient conditions in a case context, then look at some other cases to see how it works. Then one of the methodological advices is not to exclude variables that are very important, but not to get unnecessary variables into your research design. Like when imperialism was happening, a lot of things were happening. Like there is John Hobson, who has this very powerful theory about why the military-industrial complex in Britain was the mover of imperialism. There was a debate between Lenin and Hobson. There are other alternative variables that looks at Lenin ignored it. Hobson pushed it. That he said, no, imperialism is actually not because of monopoly capital, it's because of the interests of the military industrial complex, military industrial corporations. Lenin said, no, it is not because of that. It is actually because of the nature of capital. Now you can have a debate. But the point is that you in your research design are not encouraged to ignore important causes, but to either fuse them together or to look at not all that is happening in history, but after having looked at all that is happening in history, can you actually, I mean, Lenin must have known a lot about imperialism. Wallerstein would have known a lot about imperialism and neocolonialism. He even wrote historical tracts, but his model was a simple one, which explained why capital-rich countries will exploit capital-poor countries. It's a little bit like Lenin's imperialism, just adjusting to the fact that you don't need imperial power anymore. But one is not making an argument that you should not know history or you should not. But after that reading of history and after that reading of statistics, you are actually able to look at the drivers that move processes. Then the last thing that's important is the question of multicollinearity. Multicollinearity is generally more important for regression analysis. This is something that qualitative researchers can remember. And it is a little bit like saying that if you say that you have two variables, but the two variables actually both amount to the same empirical space. So one classic example of this is that dissimilar size countries having dissimilar size collaborate. And the other variable would be that non-neighboring countries collaborate. So you look at India and you find that India and Iran have dissimilar size, they collaborate. They are also non-neighboring countries. You can say that India and Myanmar are relatively more cooperative. I'm not saying this is true, but let's assume that this is true, that India and Myanmar have a more cooperative relationship than, let's say, India and Bangladesh. And India and Myanmar are dissimilar size. Such samples are problematic. This is what, I mean, it's difficult to have this problem in qualitative work, because in qualitative work, you will be able to see what your cases are and you will not get into such cases but in quantitative work, this can be a bigger problem. That you have two variables, but those variables actually incorporate similar or same cases. And that is a problem of multicollinearity. It's less of a problem for qualitative research. Are we together? Okay, then now let's start looking at causal mechanisms. And causal mechanisms are a way of arguing about causality, where you think that a certain kind of mechanism that produces causality is very, very important. It's not like democracy produces wars. It's not like oil-rich countries are autocratic. It's not like, let's say security dilemma produces wars. The question is, can we go into our cases to see why oil-rich countries are autocratic? And when we go back to our cases to see why oil-rich countries are autocratic, will we find the same mechanism at work? Or when we go back to see why security dilemma causes war, will we find the same mechanism? we'll obviously look at wars, right? We will look at autocratization. So in that vein, the argument is that for any event, like if it is a suicide or if it is, let's say, why did Hillary Clinton lose her presidential election? Was it because the opposition was weak, or was it because Donald Trump was able to play the race card very well? If you have to understand these things, you have to basically go behind the cause. And if you read, let's say, the first chapter of Jan Elster's Nuts and Bolts of Social Sciences, you'll find that the human world is sort of inhabited with a lot of aphorisms that contradict each other. That also might psychologically be pointing in different directions. But they may be partially or equally true. We don't know. So it's a little bit like saying that you can have a cognitive dissonance which suggests that grapes are sour. So, well, I wanted to go to Harvard, but I came to Heidelberg. Now I think that Harvard is no good because I came to Heidelberg. Why should I regret that? So that is cognitive dissonance. But it can also be that because you didn't get into Harvard, you actually wanted to go to Harvard more. Now, these can be two different types of psychological propensities, right? One is that because I didn't get something, grapes are sour. And the other is that because I didn't get something, I want that more. Now, what will happen is something that we will have to actually look at that person's intentions and desires to figure out which way that person is acting. While I'm just giving two desires that can be the interplay of a certain person's mindset. Similarly, let's say somebody let's say has, Alexis de Tocqueville has this famous example. He says that that marriages do marriages lead to an unhappy ending? Tocqueville says that this holds in societies where love marriages are an exception. Do love marriages lead in an unhappy ending? De Tocqueville says that in those societies where they are an exception. Why? Because in such societies, only stubborn people enter love marriages. And stubborn people are individualistic, so they will. I'm not saying that you have to, I can give you many other stories, but these are interesting stories too. The point is that if you want to understand, why marriages end or not end, if you go into the mechanism of how these marriages perform, then you can go into these nuances of why they end. If you just take two variables and run correlations, you will not understand the mechanism by which marriages end. And I mean, there are more examples you can read in the notes. So the question is that the process is a mechanism, and when you're looking at a case and you're looking at a process, you might actually see the mechanism unfold. So Shekel has this story of a bank run. Says, did a financial crisis happen in most South Asian countries because of the lack of faith in the banks and lending policies in one country, that led to a similar loss of faith in other countries as well. So bank lending has a domino effect. So how do banks survive? No bank can survive if everybody withdraws, right? Banks survive because people put a certain amount of money in the bank and keep a certain amount of money in the bank, and they feel secure that if that amount of money is not in the bank, then what will happen in a rainy day? Of course, when you're a student, you have less money in the bank. When you're working, you have more money in the bank. If you go to Wall Street, you have probably less money in the bank and more money in stocks. But banks run on this principle. Now, let's say there's a bank run in Thailand and you are in Malaysia, right? Now, maybe there was some over-lending in Thailand, and then people lost faith in the bank, and there was a bank run in Thailand. But because there was a bank run in Thailand, people in Malaysia also started taking their money away, right? So how do you understand? So the whole idea, the whole process, and maybe from Malaysia to Cambodia, maybe this virus will spread to all Southeast Asian countries. So the question is that the bank run in one country actually produces a bank run in another country in a way in which dominoes fall. Now, in order to understand these things, you can have either a kind of a do you have a Newtonian law like on bank runs, like S is equal to half GT square? If you have a Newtonian law like S is equal to half GT square, you can probably find out, or maybe you have a theory of dominoes that produces. But if you don't have such a theory, or even if you have such a theory, and if you go into the case of why one bank run in one country produces a bank run in another country, you may be able to create a theory of it, or you may be able to modify the theory of bank runs and dominoes, because you've done excellent case work. Now, if you have, let's say, a theory of bank runs depending on dominoes, you say, oh, I know why bank runs happen. Then you can call it a deductive way of thinking. That we know that the bourgeoisie produces democracy. Oh, I saw bourgeoisie and I found that the bourgeoisie is upholding democratic institutions. Theory building on the bourgeoisie and the democracy may have taken place inductively. Theory building on imperialism may have taken place inductively. Lenin might actually have been looking at imperialism very closely. But once you have propositions, you can go and test them, right? So that is the kind of, from the general to the particular. Oh, there is monopoly capital in Britain, so there will be an imperial power. Oh, United States is the most capitalist country in the world, so it will exploit the semi-peripheral and the peripheral parts of the empire. But how did South Korea grow so rapidly? How did Taiwan grow so rapidly? Why did China suddenly become a superpower? Then these things become a puzzle. That is, you have an understanding that imperialism is so powerful that there is no dynamic way for peripheral countries of the world economy to become powerful. And then you are puzzled, right? By the growth in the periphery, by the pathways from the periphery. And then maybe you will start thinking why. And then you will produce a developmental state. Oh, these guys were actually not following the market mechanism. They were hand-holding the companies. They were disciplining capital in order for it to become competitive. These kinds of ideas can come from tracing the process of how a developmental state was born, right? So you have to understand that when you actually have propositions, you can deductively take them to the democracies don't fight wars with each other. Okay, I'll run regressions. The bourgeoisie produces democracy. So Adam Schwarzschild and Lemongi ran regressions for the entire world, and they came up with the conclusion that at a per capita income between $4,000 and $5,000 per annum, there will be a transition to democracy. That can be done. But then what happens when United States of America with a per capita income of $80,000 per annum turns autocratic? What happens when India with a per capita income of maybe $200 per annum turns democratic, right? So you should be thinking both inductively and deductively, depending on the circumstances. But often causal mechanisms are useful when you have to think inductively and look at processes in order to come out with hypotheses which are often intermediate variables. So, for example, following the work of Barrington Moore, Roeschmeyer, Stevens, and Stevens' 1992 classic book on democracy and development, argued that that absence of landlords and a pro-democratic working class, these were necessary for democracy promotion. Absence of landlords or the powerlessness of landlords and a pro-democratic working class. But there were other factors also, such as the nature of the state, political parties, and the nature of the international system that produced sufficient conditions for democratic. So because Roeschmeyer, Stevens, and Stevens go into a deeply historical account, they are also problematizing the bourgeoisie produces democracy argument. And by tracing such processes, they are able to tell us, actually to a greater level of detail, what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for democracy to take place. Of course, their sample size is small and they are looking at only Western countries. So essentially, when you do process tracing, you are looking very deeply within a case and you're looking at processes that drive a causal mechanism. Okay? That is the first thing. So we started this class by saying that casework is small number of cases that you study intensively. One way of doing casework is to look at processes very closely. And you look at processes very closely because any outcome, people who do process tracing will argue, is a causal mechanism that might involve processes. So this is the additional point that I'm making right now. To give you one example, I mean, this is from the Jeffrey Checkel book. Take a simple case of learning from the past, which is called the Bayesian approach. You know something happened. Now you want to find out why something happened, so you go back to the past. And in this particular case, Checkel said that suppose there is a murder and you want to know how it happened. So the first level is the hoop test, that was the accused present on the day of the murder. This is like a necessary condition. You know that a person A, you think that a person A has committed this murder. Now, can you establish that that person was present when the murder was happened? But the presence of that person doesn't conclusively prove, right? I mean, I am teaching and the chairs are here, but I won't be teaching if you are not sitting here, right? So there could be a person and the person may not have murdered. So then there is a smoking gun test. The smoking gun test is that, was there a smoking gun in the hands of the suspect on that day? Now I'm trying to trace the process of the murder. First step is, was the murderer present? I have a strong inclination to believe that a person A committed this murder. I'm able to establish that the person was present, not convinced. The murder was performed by a bullet. Was the bullet entered into the person? I don't know, but the person had a gun. So this gives me more confirmation. But then if there was the murder took place in a bank and the bank had a camera where there was a shot of the person taking the gun and shooting the person who was murdered. That is conclusive, right? So the point is that when you're tracing processes, you are basically looking at conclusive evidence. And you're looking at the relationship between, let's say, the person who held the gun and the murder that was performed. And this is what casework can help you do. A democracy turned into autocracy. How did it happen? An autocracy turned into democracy. How did it happen? France and Germany kept fighting wars with each other till kingdom come, and then suddenly they became peaceful. Why did it happen? You understand? I mean, look at the history of France and Germany. I mean, if you go to the castle and you take the audio guide, they'll tell you the history of the castle. But one of the things that you will find in the audio guide, which is very prominent, is that the castle of Heidelberg is kept in a ramshackle situation, partly to portray the fact that the French came often and often and often to burn parts of Heidelberg. So, Heidelberg University's oldest building the Alte Aula is an 18th century building. Heidelberg is a 14th century university. Why don't you see that building? Because it was burnt. So that castle has been kept in that way. Of course, it looks nice. It looks pretty, even in a kind of rundown, burnt situation. But there's a reason why it hasn't been reconstructed into a castle that doesn't look that, because the mayor of Heidelberg probably wants you to remember that this place was ransacked. You know that Germany got united only in 1871. You can go to the Niederwald-Denkmal on the Rhine in Rudolfsheim, where the unification of Germany is. But before the unification of Germany, these were small kingdoms under the Habsburg influence, and the centralizing power of France was far more powerful. So the point is that if you want to understand that there was so much conflict between France and Germany, and then of course we have the legacy of the Second World War, where the German army was quite cruel in France. But with that history, with the French invading these parts which are now called Germany, and the German army being cruel to the French, how is it that we don't need visas, or we can travel freely and we can do all? So this is like, today when you're sitting here, this looks very, very nice and peaceful. But how did it happen? If you knew a little bit of history, you would think it's actually quite puzzling how it happened. And then you can get into the process. Then there are people who have written about the European unification and the monarchy. There's significant work in international relations that looks at today with the Trump tariff. There might be much bigger reasons for Europe to come together, because suddenly the security umbrella of the United States has been taken away. Russia threatens Europe significantly, and NATO doesn't seem to be working. So what I'm saying is that you may be excited about this fact, that how will, of course, not in the South Asian Studies program, but here, but I'm just raising general questions that, these things are happening in history, but can you take them to think in terms of more generalized problems? How are regional arrangements made more successful? How is regional cooperation promoted in the economic sphere? Does it have any connections with the security sphere? These are more generalized questions that can come out of such observation. So, one of the things that is in a book, recently Rudra Sil presented in our department this book on comparative area studies, which has its second edition. And Rudra Sil, who is one of the editors of that book, a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, recently delivered a lecture in our colloquium class. And there is a chapter by Melissa Brooks in that book where they talk about something called causal process observation. Causal process observation is an insight or a piece of data that provides information about context, process, or mechanism that contributes distinctive leverage in causal interest. This may be important for uncovering a process, but not for generalization. Now, in the beginning, when you're trying to trace processes, you're obviously not thinking of generalization, right? You just want to know how the murder happened. You're not creating a general theory for murders under those conditions, right? So the first thing is that you're excited by something and you're trying to move beyond description, and you might want to have a causal process observation, which has something to do with the context. So, for example, the context that India did not have the bourgeoisie at the time of its birth could become an important reason for you to understand the processes that produced democratic consolidation with little or no bourgeoisie, right? So every process, causal process, can have some kind of a causal process observation that produces. People may have argued that democracy was proliferated because of the incentives that came from the United States and the European Union in the 1990s. That could be something. Now look at all the countries which became democracies, half of which are now turning into autocracies. Did they become democracies because they had those incentives? Are they becoming autocratic because those incentives don't exist, which come from the multilateral level? So this is one important insight that you can think about when you are looking at causal process observation. So Melissa Brooks actually has a book where she argues that this is a book about trade union power with respect to corporation. And she says that, there can be two mechanisms, or should there be one? So she has two stories to tell. A United Kingdom securities firm called G4S conceded to the transnational alliance of obviously workers in order to keep the home union happy. So G4S is a security firm. The security firm did not have, let's say, protection for workers that the workers desired. And there was some pressure from the transnational alliance of workers. This UK firm actually conceded. But it did not concede because of the pressure from the transnational alliance. It conceded because it wanted to keep workers. She contrasts that with Raffles Hotel in Cambodia, where again the transnational alliance was concerned about how the Raffles Hotel, which was a luxury hotel, I mean, there's a Raffles in Singapore also, was not treating its workers in the way in which human rights should be protected. So there was a kind of a pressure from the transnational alliance. And in this case, Raffles relented because it wanted to keep its brand image. So Marita Brooks argues that in both the cases, you have a dependent variable, which is that workers' rights were protected. Now, in one case, workers' rights were protected more because of the pressure from the home union. And in the other case, workers' rights were protected because of the pressure of a transnational alliance, which led to the brand image consideration. So would you say that these are two different causal mechanisms? One way of thinking would be that they are two different causal mechanisms, but that in one case, it is pressure from below, which is creating the action. And in another case, it is pressure from above, which is creating the action. So she says, there are two ways of thinking about this causal mechanism. One is pressure from above and pressure from below, but you can harmonize this into one causal mechanism if you argue that it doesn't matter where the pressure comes from, but it is actually how the pressure adds up on the corporate entity that produces concessions for labor, right? So she makes both the arguments. She says that you can have the argument that you can say that there are two causal mechanisms, but you can also say that the causal mechanism has to do with pressure on the corporate entity, which may be from above or from below. So if you subsume the two in this way, then it's one causal mechanism. That pressure from above or below produces concessions, or you can think of two different causal mechanisms. So that is one way of thinking. The other way of thinking, she says, is Dan Ziblatt's book, Structuring the State, where there is a comparison between federalism in Germany and Italy. And she argues that Ziblatt does very fine process tracing of the origins and birth of federalism in Germany and Turkey, and the two are contrasting cases. In the case of Italy, you got a centralized system. In the case of Germany, you got a federal system. Why did you get a federal system in Germany? And why did you get a centralized system in Italy? He says Ziblatt has come with a nice parsimonious argument after doing detailed historical work. But the central argument is that in Italy, the provinces had not the infrastructural power to assert themselves as units. Whereas the different states of Germany, like Baden-Württemberg, Bavaria, Hessen or whatever, actually had much greater infrastructural power to negotiate with the central power and to keep autonomy. So, for example, our university, Heidelberg University, is not funded by Berlin. Now, my salary comes from Stuttgart. If you are at the Ludwig Maximilian University, professors will get paid by Munich is the capital, is it? Salaries. And these provinces are very, very assertive about the fact that they belong to Baden-Württemberg and not to Berlin. So the federal idea is very deeply ingrained. Baden-Württemberg is a rich province. Professors in Baden-Württemberg will probably get paid more than professors in Berlin. Our universities in Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg are also among the top-ranked universities in the country. It may have something to do with the fact that these are richer states, even though Berlin is the capital of the country. So I'm just I'm playing not devil's advocate, but the scholar's advocate. Ziblatt has argued something which I tend to believe. I mean, if you go to a school in Baden-Württemberg, you're likely to get a better gymnasium or a Realschule or a Hochschule. One of my sons went to a gymnasium here. We were very happy. The stories that we hear about declining schools, we didn't see in that particular school. And we don't even live in Heidelberg. We live in Neckargemünd. He went to the local school in Neckargemünd. You can go even further to Bammental. So your school systems are completely different in the different provinces. You go to Hessen, which is just, you go from Neckargemünd to Neckarsteinach, and you've gotten into another province. But all the children from Neckarsteinach are coming to the Max Born Gymnasium because they would rather do their schooling in Baden-Württemberg. And so Baden-Württemberg and Bavaria have a chin up, that, the better schools, richer states. And this is so important that, the rector of Heidelberg University will not even add the citations of the Max Planck Institutes and Embel and others which come from Brussels and from Berlin. So one of my friends, who is the director of the Heidelberg Institute of Global Health, declined a professorship at Harvard to come here. He said, we would be a top 10 university if we counted all our citations. We are still maybe a top 50 university according to some, which is not a bad rank. But the rector will not add those citations because he will only add the citations of people who are funded by Stuttgart. So that is the extent to which in other countries, they will murder people. You will not even find a smoking gun test to get a higher rank in the global university rankings. But here, the federal principle is very important. If the money is coming to the Max Planck Institute from Berlin, there is a very good Max Planck Institute for International Law. There may be one for astrophysics. There is the European molecular biology establishment here called Embel. They won't add those citations, although their students get Heidelberg degrees, because the money comes from Berlin. So the federal principle is very powerful, and Ziblatt argued that the federal principle, the power of the federal principle, has something to do with the fact that these provinces had infrastructural power. And you can understand why. Because there was no centralizing authority in Germany, right? It's only in 1871, after the Franco-Prussian War, that the different parts of Germany decided to unite. So every unit was actually very, very conscious of their status, and they kept that status. And Ziblatt would argue that that was not the case in Italy. And Marissa Brooks, who has read the book, not me, argues that it's a very fine and refined casework using process tracing, pointing to a process led by the infrastructural power of the subnational unit that actually helps the subnational unit to have greater negotiating power when the question of unification is being decided. Now, this is what Ziblatt is saying, but I'm not saying that you have to agree. I know that in the case of India, many of the states in India have been born not because of infrastructural power. They have been born more because there were identity issues and there were social movements, and the social movements carrying those identity issues succeeded. So the big state of Andhra Pradesh was divided into Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, not because Telangana had infrastructural power, because under certain political circumstances, the Telangana movement succeeded. Similarly, the state of Bihar was divided into Bihar and Jharkhand. Jharkhand was a more tribal state, and there were tribal autonomy movements that succeeded. Similarly, the state of Madhya Pradesh was divided into Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh. Chhattisgarh had more tribal autonomy. So I'm not saying that you can have an alternative explanation. Maybe one of you will stand up and say that, no, it was not infrastructural power, it was social movements. No, I'm not saying that's right or wrong. But what I'm saying is that this is a very powerful argument in a certain setting, which gives you a certain traction for understanding. You can then see, you've been able to compare France and Italy. That's not bad. That's quite good. Then you can see what is the range to which you can carry these arguments. Oh, I'm sorry, we are already past time. So we will continue this conversation, and then process tracing does, again, very nicely meld into path dependence. So I'm not unhappy that we are going a little slowly, so that before the midterm exam, we will discuss path dependence and critical judgment. Thank you.